Hello, everyone, and greetings from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Welcome to our university's Secretary of the Navy Guest Lecture Series. I am Commander Paul Rasmussen, the Program Officer of the National Security Affairs Department and Academic Associate of NPS's Great Power Competition Certificate. I am honored to be your moderator today. These lectures are a featured part of the NPS student learning experience, exposing students and faculty to prominent speakers recognized as distinguished leaders in their field of expertise. Our guest today has been one of the most impactful leaders in the military strategic realm, both in and out of uniform. His last position during his distinguished Navy career was as the commander of U.S. STRATCOM Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska. And now he is leading and serving on several boards in key areas of national defense. Today, Admiral Cecil Haney will provide a talk about great power competition in the cognitive age. At the conclusion of the remarks, he will answer questions from a team of students who will each ask a question of their own. As time allows, the guests will take questions submitted by the live stream audience. Also, after today's presentation, Admiral Haney and NPS President Rondeau will jointly recognize Vice Admiral Ed Moore as he is inducted into the NPS Hall of Fame. It is now my privilege to introduce the President of the Naval Postgraduate School, Vice Admiral Anne Rondeau, who will introduce our guest speaker today. President Rondeau, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Commander Rasmussen, and welcome to everyone from the Naval Postgraduate School, as well as many other viewers able to join us today for this terrific learning opportunity about a critical component of our national strategy, great power competition. As you heard, our speaker today, Admiral Cecil Haney, was a former commander of the United States Strategic Command, where he served from 2013 to 2016 as its leader, responsible for strategic capabilities involving nuclear weapons, missile defense, space, and cyberspace. His naval career spanned nearly 4 decades, where he served in a number of critical positions, interestingly, in a different kind of power competition than we have today, and he spanned both of those eras. His command tours included Commander, the United States Pacific Fleet from 2012 to 2013, where he was responsible for the manning, the operations, and the maintenance of the U.S. Navy in the entire Pacific and Indian Ocean areas. As a career submariner, he had command of fast attack nuclear submarine USS Honolulu, and of course submarine Squadron 1 at Pearl Harbor, and submarine Group 2 at Groton, Connecticut. He now serves on the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Board of Managers, the Naval Studies Board, the Aerospace Corporation Board of Trustees, the Board of Directors for General Dynamics, Systems Planning and Analysis, the Center for New American Security, and is the chairman of the Board of Military Child Education Coalition, an enormously important entity that serves our military families. But also importantly, the Admiral is an alum of Naval Postgraduate School, where he got his master's in engineering, acoustics, and systems technology. And he currently serves on the NPS Foundation Alumni Association Board, as well as the Council of Advisors. And if anybody knows Admiral Haney, they also know that he's the consummately gentlemanly leader who leads with a sense of purpose and principle, and has never raised his voice, but it is his intellect and his goodness and his generosity of nature and his leadership credibility across the Navy that has been his mark. So now we have an opportunity to have this discussion with him on great power competition in the cognitive age. Admiral Haney, thank you, sir, and the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, President and Admiral Ann Rondeau, for this opportunity to address your Navy Postgraduate School students and faculty and all the others assembled virtually here. Paul, I truly admire what you and others are doing here at the Navy Postgrad School to continue stimulating minds to consider a range of possible scenarios, possible problem sets, and potential solutions associated with great power competition. So do I think this subject is important? Well, absolutely. What a rich subject and a relevant and timely one. One that I would hope is being discussed formally in the curricula at the Navy Postgraduate School, but also I hope that all students attending the school, whether virtually, long distance, or on campus, are learning about this and are also having a thirst for understanding its many dimensions and, of course, its complexity. While our political leadership has changed and our strategic approach may change, the competitors associated with great power competition have not, regarding their stated goals and their objectives. We must understand and we must appreciate today's competitive environment, not just from a community or specialty position, but must take advantage of the Navy Postgraduate School environment to expand your knowledge of the competitor nations, their culture, their perspective, their ideology, and their objectives holistically, I would argue. If you read the news headlines and the Twitter feeds, you might come away with that there is only a economic or 5G competition with China, or perhaps you stumble across something about the South China Sea or our concerns in the area of trade and information protection. With respect to Russia, you might feel that we need to only concern ourselves with their election meddling, cyber techniques, or other associated cyber penetrations. But I would expect most in this audience know that both China and Russia are much more sophisticated than that, and that they are continuing to develop and improve strategic, conventional, hybrid, economical, and information warfare capabilities, and they are in fact using them. So let's take a quick look first at each of these countries just a bit more closely. I will then also follow with a discussion on strategic deterrence and why we must continue to work to ensure deterrence works. Now, being the former commander of U.S. Strategic Command, I hope you would expect me to talk about that topic because that is so critical to great power competition that we understand that deterrence and we are able to execute it. Finally, I want to talk about, given why this institution, the Navy Postgraduate School and advanced education is so important now and in the future to develop the critical thinkers in just so many areas and to develop new concept of operations and capabilities to address the threats in this 21st century in a collaborative and a free-thinking way. So what do our competitors, these nuclear nations, China and Russia, have at their disposal? Well, I hope you all know that the global security environment today is more complex, dynamic, and volatile, and perhaps more so than any other time in our history. The dangers presented by this unpredictable security environment are compounded by the continued propagation of asymmetric methods, an unprecedented proliferation of advancing technologies, and the dual-use nature of the acceleration of technical development outside normal national security channels in the commercial and in the academic circles that are just readily available to our competitors, and the increasing provocative and destabilizing behaviors we are witnessing. Now, Russia and China are investing in long-term military modernization programs, including capabilities that could pose an existential threat to the United States, and they are developing new capabilities, sustaining and are modernizing their nuclear forces, including weapons and platforms that are mobile, that are hardened, and that are also underground. So we'll talk a little bit about how to deal with that, at least my thoughts. Well, let's look at Russia. It clearly warrants our attention. Its security strategy makes clear that Russia seeks to reassert itself as a great power, and at the cost of its neighbors and regional stability. While we are hearing about Russian meddling through cyber and social media, Russia continues to modernize its conventional and strategic military programs, emphasizing new strategic approaches, declaring and demonstrating its ability to escalate if required, and maintaining a significant quantity of non-strategic nuclear weapons. In addition to its Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty busting missile, we call the SSC-8 missile system, Russia also harbors an extensive collection of non-strategic nuclear weapons with stockpiles that may be exceeding 3,000 and projected yields up to the megaton class. So most concerning is that these uncounted weapons are intended for battlefield use in conditions short of intercontinental war. While we make a distinction in treaties to date with respect to strategic and non-strategic nuclear weapons based on weapons range, if a non-strategic nuclear weapon goes off, it will have clearly strategic consequences. So while the New START Treaty covers strategic weapons, it doesn't cover these non-strategic nuclear weapons. And we'll see if we have this bridge of the New START Treaty to cover those strategic weapons. Well, we have also observed Russia engage in destabilizing actions in Syria, Ukraine, Eastern, and Crimea, and they continue to make overt and applied threats against our friends and allies in Europe, while also violating treaties and other international accords and norms. Russia is rapidly developing advanced counter space and cyber capabilities, and they have invested also in missile defense, while at the same time they argue against our limited missile defense capabilities. Well, when you look at Russia, even with its strained economy, it continues to modernize its triad of nuclear forces while flaunting new novel nuclear weapon concepts, such as the nuclear-powered cruise missile that has been in the news, as well as their advertised delivery system known as Status 6, which is a nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered underwater vehicle, an alleged robotic mini-submarine with supposedly capabilities up to 100 knots and a range of 5,000 or more nautical miles, designed to destroy important economic installations of the enemy in coastal areas and cause guaranteed devastating damage to the country's territory by creating wide areas of radioactive contamination, rendering them unusable for military, economic, or other activities for a long time. Clearly an attempt to circumvent our missile defense system. These efforts show that Russia desires additional nuclear capabilities not covered by the current treaty construct. And finally, we see Russia continuing to invest in and test hyperglide missiles, technology, and counter space capability. They're not just parading this stuff around, but they're operating it in major exercises and have even used its bomber force to fly near ours and other nations in threatening and provocative ways, even during periods of heightened tensions. Well, enough about Russia. What about China? Well, in addition to pursuing regional dominance in the East and South China Seas, China continues to make significant military investments too in its nuclear and conventional capabilities. I could almost repeat the laundry list of Russia for China, except for those novel nuclear weapons concepts that they're experimenting with. China is re-engineering its long-range ballistic missiles to carry multiple nuclear warheads and continues to develop and test hyperglide vehicle technology. Like Russia, in addition to fixed intercontinental ballistic missiles, China has also invested in road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile systems capable of carrying multiple warheads. Strategic modernization extends to naval capabilities as China continues testing and integration of its new ballistic missile submarines, their first sea-based strategic nuclear deterrence. Unclassified DIA reporting also mentions that China's Air Force also has a nuclear mission. This shows significant interest and investment in their triad concept. Now, China's pursuit of advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, conventional prompt global strike capabilities, offensive counter space technologies, and the exploitation of computer networks raises questions about its overarching intentions. You know, China periodically reminds us of its no first use nuclear policy. But these developments, coupled with the lack of transparency on nuclear issues such as force disposition and size, impact regional and strategic stability and are a cause for continued vigilance and concern. While today the number of Chinese nuclear weapons dwarfs that of the United States and Russia, it is a formidable force that is growing in capability that must be considered in any conflict involving the United States and China. With these disturbing trends, I am pleased, though, to see that we have more than just academic and theoretical discussions, but the foundation for much of this is in authoritative sources today that you all can reach and touch publicly. In other words, it's not classified. You know, when I was at Strategic Command, we struggled a bit on what we could talk about on the unclass networks because of just how we overclassed a lot of things. Or as we had discoveries, there's always some contemplation of when do you release that kind of information. But today you have a lot at your fingertips. You don't have to depend on Facebook or Twitter. The DIA website, for example, has reports on China and Russia's military power, challenges to securities in space, and the global nuclear landscape. And all these reports are no older than a couple years. The CIA also has a wealth of information readily available on its website in what's called the World Factbook. And what I like about it is online you can easily navigate and look for what you're looking for there. And it crosses not just the military, but looks across the dime, you know, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic capabilities. Very important as we look at trying to confront issues if we don't have the more holistic picture associated with how they make decisions, associated with their overarching structure and approach. And finally, one other source, and I could mention a lot of them, but one I wanted to mention too that I particularly like is the Congressional Research Services website, because they tend to put out reports for their members of Congress on topical things, some of them long, some of them just a couple pages long. Let me read a couple titles of those, for example, to you. Hypersonic Weapons, Backgrounds and Issues for Congress. China's One Belt, One Road Initiative, Economic Issues. China's 14th five-year plan for 2021 to 2025 and its economic goals out to 2035, focused on a lot of key issues of supply chain, of where they want to be economically as a power there. No, they're not asleep at the throttle. They're putting a lot of energy behind some of these things. Well, I just wanted to give you that sample. You all are probably grounded in the national security strategy under the previous administration. And I know, like I am, I'm looking forward to what the Biden administration puts out in their national security strategy. But I will say, the thinking has to be, as we look at great power competition, we can't put a firewall and not think about these nuclear weapons these major powers have. Now, Paul, can I have that one and only slide that I have for this presentation put up, please?
Affirmative.
And I'm hoping we can get that up and that the electronics work, because this is a slide I actually shared a couple times in my discussions with Henry Kissinger when I was commander of U.S. Strategic Command, and we had some rich conversations over it. I don't say that to give it credibility. I just call this my cartoon, and what I continue to use to talk about the spectrum of conflict with a nuclear adversary. You see, it depends on the situation, and we must master deterrence to ensure that no adversary will gain the benefits they seek. No adversary can escalate their way out of a failed conflict, and all adversaries understand that we can and will, if necessary, respond in a time and place, of course, in a manner of our choosing. Now, deterrence is fundamentally a human endeavor, firmly rooted in psychology and social behavior. At the most basic level, deterrence is achieved through one of two mechanisms. The first is an aggressor's recognition that unacceptable costs may be imposed for taking an action, and recognition that foregoing this action may result in lesser costs. The second is an aggressor's belief that the contemplated action will not produce its perceived benefit, or that not acting will produce a greater perceived benefit. Now, these elements combine to convince potential adversaries that they will not succeed, in an attack. And even if they try, the costs will far outweigh the benefits. Achieving comprehensive strategic deterrence, assurance, and escalation controls requires flexibility and analysis of numerous courses of action to determine the best option and combination of options to address a given situation. Today, as we craft meaningful strategic and operational plans and carry out strategic operations, the key to deterrence is maximizing leadership decision space, particularly that of the President of the United States. Now, this requires addressing the frictions of nuclear-armed adversaries early on to avoid escalation. Now, this slide, my cartoon, is a very simple depiction of this. Don't let its simplicity, however, give you the impression that controlling the spectrum of conflict with any adversary is simple, much less with a nuclear one. The X and Y axis represent a notional timeline versus intensity of a conflict. As we approach friction depicted in this lower left-hand corner, we clearly want to keep it there. We want to always provide off-ramps to the President to diffuse situations prior to conventional conflict. Those off-ramps must be driven by strategic messaging, backed with credible capability in the conventional as well as in nuclear forces. And you might add to that hybrid as well as asymmetric capabilities. This requires credibility in the nuclear forces in the perception of the adversary. Now, when I was commander of U.S. Strategic Command, I used this a lot to inform folks of why we needed to make the investments we did, of course, in a piece of the military arsenal I was responsible for. Because we have to have nuclear deterrence work. And I used to give this list when people would say, well, what do you need, Commander? What do you need in order to make it work? And I would say, well, clearly it's more than delivery systems and platforms of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines, and bombers. It's much, much more. It requires timely, infused intelligence and a synthesis of dedicated sensors to provide effective indications and warnings of impeding threats. Assured command and control to move that information to decision makers. Missile defense, resilient space and cyberspace architecture, a robust conventional force, credible nuclear weapons and their enabling infrastructure, effective policies, treaties, and non-proliferation activities, and comprehensive plans that link organizations and knit their capabilities together in a coherent manner. And it must provide options. Taken together, this deterrent capability must ensure that even in crisis strategic stability will remain intact and ensure that any adversary understands they will not get the benefits they seek, and the cost will be too much to bear if they employ nuclear weapons. Well, I would say, you might argue that this list that I provided you is not complete. Well, what about artificial intelligence, Commander? What about some of these hyperglide weapons? What about cyber? Can you use the same terminology or in such a way that these things can all be part of the equation? And I would say, I hope so. Now, there are many arguments. Can deterrence work in cyber? Can deterrence work in X? And I would just say, this is really a cognitive sport. I got a kick out of the title, Great Power Competition in a Cognitive Age. And I think because we dwell with artificial intelligence, machine learning, and some of these other capabilities, plethora of satellites staring down from the sky, and that we have done a lot more mapping of the human brain and what have you, that the cognitive age is upon us. But I would argue that we have been doing a cognitive sport in great power competition when it was just the United States and the Soviet Union, for example. And that piece continued, even though it wasn't center stage, front page material. And I would say you can take similar kinds of approaches and thinking to get at other issues. I would also say, in order to make nuclear deterrence works, all of these new concepts have to be embedded and ingrained into that laundry list I gave you of the nuclear deterrence kinds of capabilities. So keep in mind that one slide was just a one-dimensional view. Noted each of the domains, for example, the economic domain would have a similar kind of diagram. The information domain would have one, etc. And I think you get the picture. Once at U.S. Strategic Command, as I challenged my team of how could we map out the thinking of some of these leaders, Kim Jong-un, President Xi, President Putin, and their various instruments of power in our particular capabilities. And of course, it was such a complex map of these spaghetti charts that I abandoned that particular ship and decided to do what I call deep dives into understanding, well, how do these leaders make decisions? And of course, each of them were different. And this required not just bringing in the intelligence experts from one team or another, Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, what have you. I wanted a very diverse team of all of them. And I wanted them all to be part of that red team cell as we would do war games, as we would do tabletop exercises, as we would do these deep dives to think about if things got out of control, how would we address them with various options to the President of the United States, not necessarily in the nuclear weapons domain, but perhaps in movements of some of those forces, or perhaps movements of other conventional capabilities, working hand in hand with the other combatant commands. And I think that last piece is one of the points I wanted to leave you with. In the beginning of my flag officer assignments, it really seemed like we were more stovepiped in the geographical areas. And we weren't so tied together as combatant commanders, as a Department of Defense organization to provide options. I can truly say by the time I retired, I was very pleased with that integration of combatant commander thought and working together in combined exercises than I was back in the beginning of my days of wearing 1 star, much less 4 stars. And it's pleasing to me to hear that that kind of thinking continues today, because as you look at the complexity of these adversaries, in order to get into this cognitive space, in order to make it work, we truly must work together with all of our capabilities across our military, and I would argue across our whole of government. very important to get the political leaderships involved in a big way. And perhaps the last example I will give you so that we can have more time for questions and answers will be when I did have as the combatant commander the space business as well as the cyberspace, but particularly space. We were growing with how could we fuse all of this disparate information at so many different classification levels to bring it to one center in order to have timely information, in order to come up with what are they about to do? What are they contemplating? What did they just do? With capabilities that extend up into space or their impact to ours. And then how do we discuss that in a meaningful way to our civilian political leadership? So that was very interesting. I remember the national security advisor to the president touring the center. And she turned around and she said to me, well, please tell me you have one of those red phones that you can talk to your counterpart quickly in China if you needed to. And I said, well, I hate to disappoint you, ma'am, but China would tell you they don't even have a counterpart to the commander of U.S. Strategic Command. Well, the moral to that story is we've got to work in so many different ways. And even my other nugget I wanted to share with you, while I talk about military hardware and those kind of things, I am also adamant that we have to have dialogue with those who we may not like, that we put into the competitor or the potential adversary category. When I first retired, I joined the U.S.-China dialogue on nuclear strategic dynamics. And that was a very enlightening to go and meet face-to-face with Chinese in a 1.5 and a 2.0 type of construct where we could have more dialogue on strategic stability and those kind of things. I think it's so important that we do that crosstalk. In addition to our talk with allies and partners, we have to talk with those who don't think like us and who may be on the opposite end of the street, to know them, to understand them better. So I'm hoping that education that you're getting there is stimulating some of this thought and that you are expanding perhaps a bit beyond your particular curriculum to take in more about this piece of our current environment called global power competition. So I think I'll stop there so that we can go on with the panel questions before we run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Haney, for those thought-provoking comments. Now we're going to get our Q&A team involved. We have 7 students from various criteria and service backgrounds eager to contribute. First up, we have Lieutenant Commander Lindsay Fatz. Lieutenant Commander Lindsay Fatz is a foreign area officer in the United States Navy, currently enrolled in NPS's Distance Learning Great Power Competition Certificate. She is also currently the FAO Junior Detailer at Navy Personnel Command and will next be heading to Baku, Azerbaijan, where she will serve as the Chief of Office of Security Cooperation at the U.S. Embassy. Lindsay, what is your question?
Good afternoon, Admiral. As a Middle East FAO with experience in the Indo-Pacific AOR, I have seen firsthand the impact of the shift in strategic focus on our partners and how it influences both the U.S. credibility and reliability in the eyes of our partners. Taking that into account, is it more effective for the U.S. to try and deter Russian and Chinese capabilities right at Moscow and Beijing, or will we be better served to focus that money, personnel, and engagements with other nations around the world with which China and Russia are also to influence, thus increasing both our access and our partnership and our overall credibility in the world in areas with strategic choke points and major shipping lanes like Africa, South America, and South Asia?
Well, Lindsay, a great question, and thank you for it and what you're doing, particularly as a distance learning student. And I can't say enough good things about foreign FAOs, foreign area officers, having had them school me in many different countries around the world. And really, and when I say school me, I don't mean that jokingly, I mean that seriously in terms of I always like touching base with embassies before stepping foot into various countries to understand our overarching United States goals and what have you. Now to our question, you know, it's sort of like pick A or pick door number B. And I would say, like most things, it's always a combination. Clearly, when we look at overarching deterrence, not just nuclear, conventional, and some of these other areas, when you look at space and cyberspace, there's not a need to be right at the front door of a particular nation or nation state. But there are other times where that is appropriate in order to signal, etc. You may not be able to signal from afar. So there's always this combination of what you have in your tool bag and how you use it. But then it gets to that investment question that was the underpinning side of what you just asked. And this, to me, the investments have to always be tied to strategy. And that's why, as I looked at now Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin's hearing, confirmation hearing, and listening to some of the questions that he received, clearly they were a lot focused on, are you going to still follow the national security strategy of the previous administration? The good news is every administration, when they roll in every 4 or 8 years, it really has to take and sample the environment and come up with their thing. And then with it, we have to make sure we have the capabilities across the military and across the government in order to carry out that strategy. And that requires investment. And some of that involves things that must get close and personal. And some of those things involve things that have to have incredible stealth to get close, given the plethora of anti-air capability and what have you. And in some capabilities, you can do the business from afar. I would say one of the things that I think we underinvest in is how we message. And that's not military hardware, but so important to really go through. And I'm hopeful with all our computer processing power and all the big brains, we can do a lot more with understanding how did messaging in the past work? Did it work? Did it not work? And really understand the intricacies of that as we look at how do we message a particular adversary that you're wasting your time investing in this particular area because it's not going to work. And so I think it's very, very important. You know, you could say, well, let's just invest in lots of missile defense and that will take care of the problem. But as you can see in our history of missile defense, hitting a bullet with a bullet's hard physics. A lot of good stuff perhaps going on there at Monterey over the years that helped in how far we've come along. But if you had to have X number of missiles to confront one incoming, and then you had to multiply that to even more, whether it's to protect the continental United States, whether it's to protect our forces overseas and what have you, there's a rather challenging math problem to pursue in terms of the budget. So I think you have to be able to have the flexibility of doing both. But I do believe it is most important that we include our allies and our partners in everything we do to the maximum extent possible, because the collective is always more powerful when they are locked in step and when they invest in capability and what have you, and are aligned in their thinking to deter better, and if deterrence fails, to turn the tide in a conflict in the direction we would want it to be. Yeah. So, Lindsay, I hope I answered your question, or at least got at least a C- on it. We'll see.
Nice job. All right, next, Admiral, we have Captain Tim Bettis. He's a Air Force Foreign Area Officer researching soft power competition between Arab powers in Southeast Asia. He's also the president of the NPS International Club and a U.S. Air Force Intelligence Officer. After training, he will head to Riyadh to serve as the Deputy Air Attaché to the U.S. mission in Saudi Arabia. Tim, what is your question?
Good afternoon, sir. As you had alluded to in your speech, you talked about how advanced sensors and nascent technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques are on the cusp of delivering a never before seen quality of information to decision makers, which promises to revolutionize warfare. However, we know that in the realm of cognition, humans inside this command and control loop are still fallible. Not only does confirmation bias, as I know as an intelligence officer, already lead us to cherry pick the information we choose to trust, but advancements in digital media threaten to erode the concept of truth as we know it, weaponizing information on a strategic scale and potentially prompting people to act in response to these constructed realities. What is the nature of the threat that disinformation poses on our society and on our military? Does it represent an asymmetric threat on our military readiness or lethality? And what must be done to shore up these weaknesses? Thank you.
Excellent question, Tim. Boy, we got some smart people there at school. That's excellent. Wow. Well, I think you all, as I looked through, you had a conversation with a former leader, actually a former neighbor of mine that was leading the Jake at Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. And I'm sure he had some great things to say about this, how far we've come, but how far we have to go in that regard. And this is all about trust. And I sort of smiled at that because I was having a little bit of a flashback of Ensign Haney on the USS John C. Calhoun moons and moons ago. And we used to call our sonar system, our fire control system, the green screen of lies. Because you could stack those dots up straight up and down and say, Captain, I have a firing solution. And he would look and say, that's ridiculous. That's not going to work. Because the technology, of course, were such that the algorithms were so rudimentary that it didn't give you confidence in that particular capability. By the time I retired, boy, we had a whole different story in terms of that. There was no more green screen. It was multicolor. And it had algorithms that were continually updated at the return of submarines from real missions. And was really designed to be more ergonomically than what, of course, I grew up with in the past, and thank God for that. But with this business of artificial intelligence, etc., we have to build in against that confidence and trust of what does it do good and why do we think so versus what it doesn't. Because we haven't gotten to a state where everything we do in artificial intelligence gives us that perfect answer that has no ambiguity associated with it and what have you. We're growing toward that in certain specific niche areas, I would argue. And as such, those need to be understood. Because when we talk about disinformation today, it's more than just social media. Our adversary wants to be able to take and confuse our common operational pictures that our commanders have to make decisions, whether at the tactical level, the operational level, or the strategic level. So when we build that system to scan the pixels associated with perhaps one of our satellites that have gone over country X or Y, and we say, well, boy, it's done it 1,000 times. I know I can push that. I believe. We have to also have a sense of perspective and say, well, okay, does this still make sense in terms of what it's providing and why, what's behind it? What are we seeing from other indications and still fuse it? Or at least design those systems that I used to argue for when I was in a command, that I wanted to see a confidence level or something in it and not just a yes, no kind of bistable. Very, very important to understand what is it providing me and what is it not providing me, or what are those questions that are still on the table? Whether you're getting that from an intelligence expert verbally, through human-to-human contact, or whether you're getting it from the calculator that works to produce what we're calling artificial intelligence today in terms of what's happening with country X or Y. Very hard when we talk about how well do we map what's going on in the human brains, the brains that we know, much less the brains of those we don't know so well. And it's interesting to me, this cognitive age did not start for Cecil Haney as a flag officer. It really started for me back when I was an ensign, and we used to really look at the leadership of the forces we were opposing and trying to understand what their next move would be based upon their historical data. Very rudimentary, but clearly it was on the cusp of what we're after today, because the speed of decisions, high quality decisions, is probably what's going to give us a big edge in the future in conflict or in making deterrence work. So I hope I've gotten up to a C+ with you in that question. We will see going forward.
All right, thank you, Tim. Next up, Admiral, we have Lieutenant Brandon Carter, who's in the electrical engineering curriculum with specialties in power and electronics. Brandon is also the NPS president of the local chapter of the National Naval Officer Association. Prior to NPS, he was the electrical officer on board the USS Iwo Jima and is expecting to be stationed at the repair facility as an engineering duty officer in Yokosuka, Japan upon graduation. Brandon, what is your question?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for speaking with us today. Sir, as complex as it must be to understand the psychology and sociology of these competitors to make decisions, has an emotional intelligence approach become a strategy for understanding the history of competitor actions, or for predicting their future actions, or for that matter, the past and future actions of our own leaders? Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Brandon, and thanks for all you're doing. And you're going to one of my favorite places out there in Japan. Excellent assignment. In this cognitive space, emotional intelligence strategy, interesting combination of words in terms of things. But I think what you're getting at is a bit of what I used to call, how do we really map out a leader's thinking in terms of what has he or she done in the past, and what were those circumstances, and how can we apply them today or in the future as we look at dealing with a conflict that's gone beyond the friction point. And I think this is an area, not just a strategy, but something that we have to be drooling to understand. And that is so important at the political leadership level, and I think also at the military leader level in terms of who answers to that political leader, in terms of what are the options they think. Is this a time and place that we ought to challenge the United States of America and its allies, or not? And I think that takes a very holistic approach. You can't just do that with in many cases, a U.S. perspective. You've got to pull in allies and neighbors. You want to understand the Chinese, you might have to talk to Singapore, for example. And I just picked them because they're in that neighborhood. But they look very hard at what China is doing, for example. And that's the blessing of being able to pull together allies and partners and fuse that kind of thinking. But I think it's a one that you can't just get on the cheap. You've got to have a long-term investment in that sort of thing. When Russia started growing in capability and of course in actions we did not like, particularly over Crimea and the Ukraine and what have you, there was a bit of a scramble in, where are all those intelligence experts associated with Russia? When we had to bleed a bunch of that off in order to do the counterterrorism business, very important to us in terms of how do you balance the scale associated with things. So I think this is an area, though, that requires investment as we look at both great power competitors, as we look at, and to me, I think we can learn a lot from our work that we did in the counterterrorism, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and what have you, because when you talk to a lot of our special operating force people and leaders, they were really into the cognitive space of the adversaries and gave them upper hand in many cases associated with what we're after. And I just think this business, you call it emotional intelligence, I would just like to expand its, that's a piece of it, but it's the system of systems in terms of who also surrounds that particular leader that he or she listens to historically. And will they listen in this case? What's our thinking there? And again, you can't just have a yes, no answer. You got to have a confidence level. And then what is missing from the intelligence that gives you that might be very, very important in terms of formulating that confidence level. But I think it's an area that if we ignore it, it's to our peril. It's very, very important. And while we get excited over some of the Gucci technological contraptions and systems and what have you, and those we must have too, obviously, but we must invest in the intellectual thinking that supports this emotional intelligence strategy that you're talking about. So that may be a wishy-washy answer, or maybe back to C- again, but I hope you get the picture in terms of what's all involved in that kind of thinking.
Admiral, we're just wanting to make sure you're doing okay on time for a few more questions.
I am.
Okay, good.
Oh,
all right.
I wasn't sure if you were talking to me or Admiral Rondeau, but
I'm sorry, Admiral Haney. Yes. Next up, we have Major Celeste Luxus with some questions from the virtual audience. Major Luxus is a student in the National Security Affairs Department studying to be a CENTCOM Air Force Foreign Area Officer. Previously, she served a personnel officer and her at Buckley Air Force Base, and she's projected to graduate this March and still awaiting details of her assignment. Celeste, what are the questions from the audience?
Good afternoon, Admiral Haney. The first question is from Lieutenant Melissa John Moore, and her question, sir, is how would you assess the risk of strategic deterrence failure against countries who continue to develop and test nuclear weapons against U.S. pressure? Is the U.S. deterrence capability weakening given great power competition?
Well, thank you for that question. I first want to salute you for using a word I should have included in my speech, which is the R word, risk. I think it's always an important thing to consider in everything we do. I talked about confidence level, but the risk associated with doing something and not doing something is very, very important. You framed that question in terms of given the capabilities of other competitors and other players in the nuclear arena, are we doing enough in order to maintain and sustain our deterrence now and into the future is sort of how I'm rewording that question a bit. Hopefully I got it about right. I think it is a good question. We have been talking about modernizing our strategic deterrent forces for a long, long time. And we're in a cusp of movement in some of that capability in terms of the hardware, the platforms, the command and control and communications capability, the satellites that support the business, and what have you there. But we still have a long, long ways to go. And even when we look at some perhaps new thinking in terms of how do you address some of these novel weapon approaches that Russia's talking about, and we know, one, the triad has got to be formidable, and that's part one of the equation. But then we have to also look at whether or not our plans and capability our plans support the capability and capability support the strategy that we're of course after. So I think, we have to really be careful as we look at that, because that extends more than just a Minuteman and an ICBM silo. That goes all the way to the infrastructure that certifies and validates that nuclear weapon is still a weapon a warhead that's going to detonate, if heaven forbid, we have to do that sort of thing. That has to be in the minds of the adversary, regardless of their capability, that what we have will work. We also have to be very schooled and polished, I fundamentally believe, when we message things associated with nuclear deterrence. That is a capability within itself, but one that, I will say, from my experience, that became a bit less fashionable, if you will, in terms of some of the other areas that we have to get at. In fact, I can remember one particular engagement I had with a senior statesperson. I'll leave the name blank. And they were surprised we still have nuclear weapons capabilities, for example. So you can imagine if you're trying to do a low yield this, or you're trying to look at and even talk about other options, how much of a hill you have to climb in order to get the associated funding and backing associated with it. And that's why I think the business of making sure, as we look at how to address asymmetric threats, hybrid threats, as we look at how to address conventional threats, we have to remember, if that particular nation has nuclear capability, we can't just do that and think we can wave that one off and that's just going to be firewalled. Because if he starts moving that stuff around on the adversary side, it will start to give us great concern if we haven't thought about it in a deep way before getting to that point. So I look at deterrence, and that's why I had that long laundry list of capability, because it's inclusive of so many things that have to work. And with it, yeah, we're able to use some of that capability for other things. Obviously, the robust conventional force that I had on the list. But we cannot short sheet that capability as long as there are other nation states with nuclear capabilities. So I hope I've gotten back up to a C+, but you'll probably email me. I think it was Lieutenant Moore with that particular question.
All right, thank you, Admiral. Admiral, we're going to go with one more question so we can go to the Hall of Fame ceremony very soon. And the last question is going to be from Lieutenant Matthew Lanew, who is a submarine warfare officer assigned to the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department here at NPS, researching vulnerabilities in 5G networks. Matthew is also the Naval Submarines Northern California chapter president. Previously, he was assigned to the USS Texas in Pearl Harbor, and he'll be returning to the Advanced Submarine Course in Groton, Connecticut. Matthew, what is your question?
Thank you, sir. Admiral, a key aspect of great power competition that I believe you've alluded to is our ability to attract and retain talent. Recently, employees at some of the large tech companies within our nation have come together to oppose several government contracts over either perceived or actual ethical concerns. How do we, as the military, improve our relations with these tech giants to help support great power competition?
What a great question, and I salute you for that. Non-trivial problem. I think it's very important as a nation that we are able to make sure that people understand why this struggle is so important to our future in that regards, and they clearly understand what this capability we're trying to develop, why it is important to the United States and perhaps to mankind as a whole. Sometimes the firewalls we put up prevent some of that candid conversation that must occur as to what's important. Sometimes I feel the government also, though, has to have its own inherent capability to be able to do and develop and design things. But we must, as a country, manage that very, very carefully. Just seeing the political fuss over COVID-19 and how to approach it, how best to protect themselves, whether you should get a vaccine or not, is just indicative of that piece. and how we really have to go forward and make sure as we talk about these things that we provide it in a very factual, in a very coherent manner that people understand. In that piece, we have to spend some quality time thinking about it here as well in the cognitive age. Not the first time mutinies have occurred, I would say, in the history of the United States, but something that really, really warrants, I think, our attention going forward.
All right, Admiral Haney, thank you. That was the final question. And thank you, students, for your fantastic, insightful questions. Before I turn this back over to President Rondeau for the Hall of Fame ceremony, let me announce that our next virtual Secretary of the Navy guest lecture will be on 16 February. And it'll be a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Dr. Bill Phillips, whose research was critical to atomic clocks and precision navigation for the U.S. Navy. And he will talk about quantum science, atomic clocks, and all the coolest stuff in the universe that is important to U.S. naval forces. It'll be moderated by NPS professor and quantum scientist, Dr. Frank Narducci. Over to you, Admiral Rondeau.
Admiral Haney, we want to thank you so very much, and we're so thrilled that you be part of our next event here. I do want to be able to continue that. So with your indulgence, sir, I'm going to go ahead and get us over to the next event. But Admiral, thank you very, very much for all of your time and your extraordinary leadership in the past, and your mentoring and your coaching of all of us as we think about these things in rational, intelligent, and thoughtful ways. And sir, we thank you very much.